So, long story short, this was supposed to be a video about the Vichy French-Siam War over the control of Indochina during the early years of the Second World War. However, I had a cool sponsor reach out that I think a lot of you, particularly those of the anime variety of fan base, would like. And because of that, you're getting a video about the Battle of Tsushima, one of Russia's worst ever defeats at sea so far. That brings us to the sponsor of today's video, Sakuraco. Now, I know many of you are weebs, it so happens that I am not. I'm clearly better than you because of it. But above all, what I am is a foodie. And if you couldn't tell by my divinely thin figure, we align extremely well here on the fact that you like Japanese products, I like Japanese food. It's a match made in heaven. I accept your problems, you accept mine. So instead of showing you a terrible ration today and putting something horrific in my body, I'm showing you this amazing snack box by Sakuraco. Click the link in the description to order yourself a box. They are extremely well priced, and I get a little bit off every sale from the link, from my affiliate link in the description of the comments. Now, inside these boxes you get a treasure trove of snacks, goodies, like I got a little plate, it was cool. And the best part, you actually support the conservation of historical food making by doing it. And that's the coolest bit to me, is that you're helping keep history alive through eating snacks. Like, what's not to love? Each box comes with a guidebook telling you how each snack is made, the history of it, and some interesting facts about it, along with dietary requirements and stuff for food allergies. And genuinely, it's brilliant. I get to snack. It's snacks that don't make me feel extremely unhealthy. You get to help protect some history and try new things. And you also get to learn something along the way. So, again, what's not to love? This month's box, which I've been showing on screen from my unpacking of it, it's all cherry blossom themed, which is, again, really cool. And there's this nifty bit of artwork and description that comes with it too. So click the link in the description or pinned comment. Anything you order from this supports the channel in a huge way, and you get snacks out of it. And because of them, you're getting a video about the Battle of Tsushima. So really, at the end of the day, they're already paying dividends for you. Now, you all know the story of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, the Kamchatka, the torpedo boats, the comedy, the zoo, the torpedo boats, the pain of the Aurora, and, well, the torpedo boats. But that video, the one that started the channel, I ended it right as the Japanese fleet found the Russians. Well, more specifically, as the Russians accidentally found the Japanese fleet, but we'll get into that. I didn't go into the absolute insane smackdown that followed it, until now. The Battle of Tsushima was fought on the 27th and 28th of May 1905, and it stands as one of the most decisive naval engagements in history. It's hard to put it any other way, it changed absolutely everything. It was a modern Trafalgar. It took place during the final phase of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and the battle resulted in the near total destruction or capture of the Russian Baltic Fleet by the Imperial Japanese Navy. More than that, Tsushima marked a turning point in global warfare. It demonstrated just how effective modern technology could be if used correctly with correct doctrines, and it shifted the balance of power in East Asia away from Europe. But above all of this, it shattered forever the idea that the Europeans were superior in every way to the uncivilized world in the art of war, even if the Europeans didn't just take the hint yet. Oh, and to add to that, it directly helped lead to multiple revolutions within the Russian Empire and, quite literally, Pearl Harbor. Now, I won't focus too much on the conflict, just to give you a bit of backstory and set the scene though. By the late 19th century, Russia sought warm water ports in the Pacific and had expanded its influence across Siberia, and this culminated in the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway in a region dubbed Yellow Russia. Yes, it's called yellow because it's in China. Yes, it has the connotations you think it has. Japan, recently modernised through a brutal civil war called the Meiji Restoration, viewed Russian expansion as a direct threat to its security and its regional ambitions, aka Japan and Russia both wanted to expand in the same region. Tensions escalated throughout the early 1900s, and in February 1904 Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, and here we have arrived at the Russo-Japanese War. Although the attack did not completely destroy the Russian naval power in the Far East, it effectively bottled up the Russian Pacific Fleet. As the war progressed, Japanese land forces achieved a series of victories in Manchuria, while Japan gradually tightened its naval blockade of Port Arthur. By the end of 1904, the Russian position in the Far East had deteriorated significantly. Port Arthur fell in January 1905, and it eliminated Russia's primary Pacific naval base as the relief fleet sat idle in Madagascar, having sailed from Europe months earlier. It was kind of busy being a zoo and having boat races and shooting the Aurora and, all the stuff and all the chameleons on the flagship that you couldn't see the problem. You get the jokes. You remember where I came from with that. Anyway, the fleet was now given a new task: break through the blockade and make for Vladivostok. As the floating circus made its way around the world, nearly starting multiple wars and ruining Russian relations in a way that would impress even Vladimir Putin, the Japanese combined fleet commanded by Admiral Togo made its preparations. A highly respected officer educated in Britain and deeply familiar with modern naval doctrine, Togo understood that Japan's victory depended on preventing the Russian fleet from reaching Vladivostok, where it could threaten Japanese supply lines and prolong the war. Japanese intelligence played a crucial role in the coming battle, so Japan monitored Russian movements closely, and correctly predicted that the Russians would attempt to pass through the Tsushima Strait, the shortest, most direct route to Vladivostok. The Japanese Navy therefore deployed scouting ships and prepared a coordinated interception plan relying heavily on wireless telegraphy, a relatively new but incredibly decisive technology. The idea was the fleet would be ready, combined, and waiting, ready to go at a moment's notice when it came to preparing steam, and when news came, it would steam at full speed to engage. Unlike the Russians, the Japanese crews were well trained from the start. They were highly motivated and experienced from earlier naval engagements in the war. Japanese ships were faster, better maintained, and equipped with superior ammunition choices. The gap between the two fleets cannot be understated here. While we're here, I think it's important to go over the battle fleets just so we can get an idea of who is facing who. The Russian fleet consisted of a total of 11 battleships, but I use that term extremely loosely. The 4 battleships that really mattered here were the Suvorov, which was the flagship, Imperator Alexander III, Borodino, and Oriol. All of the Borodino class, and all taking heavy influences from French shipbuilding conventions. They had the pronounced tumble-home hull, for example. There were multiple older battleships too, including the Oslabaya, Sysoy Veliki, Navarin, Imperator Alexander II, General Ushakov, Admiral Senevin, and Admiral Ushakov. However, those last few, they were all technically coastal battleships, and also they had the distinction of being the Sink by Themselves Squadron. Yes, that was their nickname. It's very, very positive. Facing this ragtag group of ships, with 4 modern ships and, a collection of old ones, was the very frighteningly modern Imperial Japanese Navy combined fleet, led by the battleship Mikasa, followed by Shikishima, Fuji, and Asahi, and a whopping 29 cruisers, 21 destroyers, 45 torpedo boats, and 22 auxiliaries. Russia only had 9 destroyers, 9 auxiliaries, including the Kamchatka, which is kind of a negative modifier, and 9 cruisers. Japan was completely strapped in this situation and ready to go. In the early hours of the 27th of May 1905, Japanese scouting ships sighted the Russian fleet entering Tsushima Strait under foggy conditions. In a funny turn of fate, this occurred because the Russian ships, the ships that had been freaking out and misidentifying everything that floats the entire voyage, including shooting up a British fishing fleet for being Japanese torpedo boats, didn't recognise the Japanese ships in the region and signalled them basically saying, "Hi, we're here." At approximately 4:45 in the morning, the Russian presence was confirmed, and wireless signals were rapidly alerted Admiral Togo on the battleship Mikasa, and he set the whole combined fleet to sea. Throughout the morning, Togo manoeuvred his fleet into an advantageous position, ensuring that his main force would engage the Russian line under optimal conditions. The Russians, travelling in a long, unwieldy formation, were already at a disadvantage. Their slower speed and poor coordination made it difficult for them to respond effectively to the Japanese movements too. Now keep in mind the Russian fleet had been at sea for an incredibly long time on an incredibly hard voyage. Granted, a lot of the hardness was of their own making, but it was still exhausted. Its ships' hulls were dirty, and they were slowed because of it. By late morning though, both fleets were aware that they were going to start shooting at each other very, very soon, and the stage was completely set. At approximately 13:30, the two fleets finally made visual contact, and shortly thereafter the first shots were fired. Admiral Togo wasted absolutely no time in executing one of the most famous maneuvers in naval warfare, crossing the T. By turning his fleet across the head of the Russian formation and using his speed, Togo positioned his ships so that they could bring their full broadsides to bear, while the Russians could reply only with their forward guns. and this completely negated any perceived disadvantage the amount of large caliber guns on all the Russian battleships had. From around 1400 to 1600s, the Japanese battleships and cruisers unleashed intense, accurate fire. Japanese shells caused massive damage upon impact too. They started fires, they destroyed command and communication systems. The battleship Oslabaya, an older Perizabet class, was sunk very early in the engagement due to this withering fire, while the Kuznets Suvorov, Admiral Roshesvensky's flagship, was completely crippled. The Russians didn't go down without firing back though, because throughout the voyage, with, all the hell and misery that likely eventually attributed to the death of Roshesvensky, he had managed to beat some kind of gunnery into his crews. The Russian ships fought as hard as they could on this doomed endeavour, and they fired into the Japanese ships, causing significant damage. But it was nothing significant enough to stop the Japanese ships. The Russians would also desperately attempt to maintain formation, but confusions just began to spread rapidly. Signals began to be misunderstood or ignored, ships started to collide, fall out of line, and coordination became impossible. The Japanese, by contrast, maintained disciplined formations and concentrated their fire, picking one target and moving on to the next, with devastating efficiency. For those wondering, Kamchatka was lit up by Japanese gunfire during this period, and she went down, leaving 50 of her crew in the sea. These men would be picked up by fishermen and other Japanese vessels and taken as prisoners of war. We still have no idea why the Kamchatka was as stupid as it was, but hey, that's what happened to it. By late afternoon on the 27th, the Russian fleet was in complete chaos. Roshesvensky was severely wounded, and effective centralized command had ceased to exist. Individual Russian ships fought on, with some attempting to break through to get to Vladivostok, and others doubled back to run south or seek interment in the Philippines. The light cruiser Zemchug, for example, one that we've spoken about before that would later be sunk in the First World War by a German raider, was one of these ships. She ran south to hide in Manila. As darkness fell, the Japanese shifted tactics. Instead of continuing gunnery duels in the fading light, Togo ordered his battleships to hold, sending his destroyers and torpedo boats in to launch night attacks against the disorganized Russian fleet. These attacks were relentless and terrifying, and they exploited the Russian fleet's exhaustion and its disorientation. Throughout the night, torpedoes struck multiple Russian ships, sinking some and disabling others. Crews abandoned their burning vessels, and survivors were left struggling in the cold waters, only to be picked up by Japanese fishermen, or also Japanese warships. At dawn on the 28th, the small part of the Russian fleet that had maintained its cohesion attempted to escape northwards to Vladivostok, but only a handful of ships remained operational, and many were damaged, low on ammunition, or completely out of coal and unable to retain high speeds. The Japanese forces refused to let the Russians breathe here, and they pursued them relentlessly. By mid-morning, the Japanese ships had surrounded several Russian battleships under the command of Rear Admiral Nikolai Nebogotov, who had assumed command after Roshesvensky was rendered unconscious. Recognizing the hopelessness of his situation, and unwilling to sacrifice more lives, which, rare for a Russian commander, Nebogotov made the extraordinary decision to surrender at approximately 10:30. Several Russian ships, including the battleships Oriol, had their colours struck and were boarded. Other Russian vessels were sunk, scuttled by their crews, or fled to neutral ports where they were interned. By the end of the 28th, the battle was over. The Russian Baltic fleet had ceased to exist as a fighting force, in such a decisive manner that you could easily compare its destruction to that of the French at Trafalgar. The scale of the Russian defeat, simply put, is staggering. Of approximately 38 ships that entered the battle, 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, and most of the remainder were interned or escaped in damaged conditions. 5,000 Russian sailors were gone in an afternoon. Russian casualties numbered in the thousands, with many sailors killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Japanese losses, meanwhile, were incredibly light by comparison. Japan lost no battleships and suffered relatively low casualties. The destruction of the Russian fleet eliminated any remaining hope that Russia could continue the war effectively. Within months, both sides entered negotiations, leading to the Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905, mediated by US President Theodore Roosevelt. The Japanese, following their capture of enemy ships, would actually take multiple Russian vessels into service. The Oriole, for example, would become the battleship Iwami, and the cruiser Variag, captured in the war, would also enter service. Japan entered the war arguably weaker and with less ships than it left the war. It almost got an entire free battleship squadron with cruisers and escorts to boot from the Russians here. But dear viewer, I hear you may ask, what happened to Roshesvensky? I mentioned he was wounded, but let's go over his life after the battle and how he got away. During the battle, Rozhesvensky took at least 2 separate wounds. The first wound was not too serious and he was able to remain at his post and command effectively, however the second wound he suffered caused significant injuries to his head and legs. These wounds were caused by repeated hits to the exposed conning tower, and due to how dangerous the situation was becoming, the Admiral and survivors were brought below. It is here that details get hazy, to say the least, because we have no idea where and what he got up to until he was later found sitting in the remains of the ship's right 6-inch turret, where he remained for about an hour before losing consciousness due to his wounds. The unconscious Admiral was then transferred to the destroyer Buini by loyal sailors, and it was here that Rozhesvensky regained consciousness very briefly. The destroyer, however, would suffer from engine problems caused by the barrage from the Japanese ships, and so now again the unconscious Admiral was transferred to the destroyer Budovi, and he would be taken prisoner when Budovi was later captured by the destroyer Sazanami. He would later remain in captivity until after the signing of the Treaty of Portsmouth, when he would at last be returned to St. Petersburg via the Trans-Siberian Railway. In one of the most interesting conversations that we will never hear from history, the victorious Admiral Toga would later visit him during his convalescence. Allegedly, and the allegedly is doing a lot of reaching here because I couldn't find anything to actually confirm he completely said this, he did console Rozhesvensky by telling him that defeat is the common fate of a soldier. There is nothing to be ashamed of in it. The great point is whether or not we have performed our duty. I've seen 5 different versions of that quote, and to me it stings a bit of possible post-war propaganda, maybe. But, what I would give to hear that conversation, I'm sure they spoke about something incredibly interesting during it. Most likely they probably did it in French or something, or with interpreters into French, because a lot of Russians spoke French, and it's a diplomatic language. With the end of the war, Rozhesvensky left Japan on November 23rd aboard the transport Yakut. This was supposed to be sooner, but he was delayed a bit by over a week first due to the fact Rozhesvensky demanded that he take a Russian ship. But then riots in Vladivostok and a mutiny on the first ship he attempted to take kind of stopped that. Standard Imperial Russia shenanigans at this point. In 1906, Rozhesvensky, now back in Russia, faced court-martial for the disaster, along with each of his surviving battleship commanders. Some were sentenced to prison and some to firing squad for either losing the battle or surrendering their ships. To be captured, the Tsar's court was fully aware that Admiral Nebogotov had surrendered the fleet and not Rozhesvensky, as he had been wounded and unconscious for most of the battle. But Rozhesvensky was adamant in the defense of his admiral, saying that, as commander, he maintained total and sole responsibility, pleading guilty to losing the battle as, after all, he was the admiral and the buck stopped with him. As was expected by the courts, though, this was all a formality, as the Tsar commuted the death sentences to the captains to short prison terms and pardons for the remaining officers. What you got depended on how important you were to the imperial court, to be completely honest. Rozhesvensky would actually survive for 5 more years before dying in 1909. Naturally, his cause of death, as many would say, was not at all service or stress related. In a way, his death in 1909 is kind of merciful, though. It means he didn't have to see the revolution and the horrifying fates that befell many other Russian officers. One fun fact about the man is he carried on quite literally dozens of insane affairs. He would make Babington blush. There's like 3 people who'll get that reference. And he turned many high-ranking Russian sailors into complete cuckolds. Just in case you didn't find him funny enough for his actions with the binoculars and the screaming at other ships, he was also cuckolding half of the Russian naval command. Thank you again to Securico for sponsoring the channel and the video. I will include my affiliate link in the description below and or the pinned comment. I really do think they're an awesome deal, and the price is really, really good for a number of things you actually receive, and on top of that, you are helping preserve traditional cooking methods, and to me, that's kind of the coolest part, because, yeah, how often do we get to say that we get to, eat things as they were traditionally cooked? Special thanks, as always, to patrons, channel members. There's now over 200 members, and I think it's 180 patrons, which is, mental to me. Paying patrons, I should clarify. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time.